Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world, and loads of love to each and every one of you. You're all very special to me. So I do hope that you're incredibly well and that you've had the most phenomenal day and that you're going to get that hot cup of cocoa because we still need it with the weather being cold out there. And why not spoil yourself with lots of marshmallows and be rather decadent? Otherwise, just get a little bit more conservative with a cup of tea or coffee and join me for a fabulous story. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Pearl and I'm from the rich cultural evergreen state of Washington. I've lived here all my life, but the story that led to my incredulous encounter with the hairy man happened when my husband and I moved to the small picturesque town of Forks in 1994. The quaint little town is situated on the Olympic Peninsula, and we have amazing silvery rivers here, known for their abundance of steelhead and salmon, and to the east of our town is the Olympic National Park. We chose to settle in this idyllic part of the world because it's absolutely exquisite here, with a thriving, spirited community and a close-knit, warm, welcoming populace. We moved into a really spectacular green leafy neighbourhood here, where all the individualistic houses had been built relatively close together, with pristinely manicured front and back yards. In truth, I think even the most mediocre of homes would find it incredibly difficult to look ugly here, surrounded by such sumptuous evergreen foliage. We moved into a whimsical, rather romantic craftsman-style home with a typical low-grey roof, wide eaves and triangular exposed beams, accentuated by thick round columns and a very sizable but attractive old-world stone porch. Our neighbourhood is heavily flanked by a vast area of dreamy natural forest made up primarily of spruce and Douglas firs trees, set up against the most panoramic views of undulating green valleys and the imposing hazy silhouettes of the mountains in the distance. One of the reasons we bought the house was because it possessed the most exquisite showpiece in the backyard, or pièce de résistance if you like, an archetype of note, shall I say, in the form of a quintessential koi pond that had been designed ingeniously by the previous owner. It would seem that no expense had been spared on the creation of this extraordinary conquest that had been executed with the finest attention to detail. It was overflowing with dozens of sizable, very beguiling large koi carp in the richest and brightest oranges that you've ever seen. Surprisingly enough, the koi were so friendly that when you put your fingers into the water, they would nibble you. I loved sliding my hands down their long, elongated bodies. This silvery gem was surrounded by sculptural rocky outcrops, and there were dreamy waterfalls that jetted white water down the rocky crevices into the rock pools below. And its crashing sound was so calming and relaxing. The rock pools were scattered with the most delicate ethereal pink and yellow flowing water lilies. On one side it was heavily fringed by clumping bamboo, and another with bank of Canadas, which are an aquatic plant that help keep the pond clear by absorbing all the harmful nitrates in the water. This silvery expanse of shimmering water also possessed a very distinguishing feature, a purple bridge that brought out all the greens in the garden so magnificently. Then there were a couple of picturesque willow trees with very Junesque-shaped trunks swathed in carpets of luxuriant green moss and draping feathery leaves that hung over the water's edge. It was like a magical, enchanting sanctuary, and I even placed a whimsical statue of a large fairy in this perfect oasis, which might sound rather twee, but the whole area possessed that quintessential fairy tale fantastical feeling about it. I loved nothing more than chopping the vegetables for dinner and glancing out of my window towards the pond and watching the water cascading down the rocks. It was so beautiful to behold, and I would often just gasp because it would take my breath away. After living in Fork for over a year, I began to develop some close friendships with the locals in my neighbourhood, and we would often interact on social occasions with barbecues and drinks at sunset. One day I discovered that my next-door neighbour, a lady that I'm going to call Diane for the purposes of the story, had a secret up her sleeve that she wanted to reveal to me. I was promptly invited over to her house for tea to find out the source of this mystery. I remember she surreptitiously led me into the backyard, and I was in shock, for there before me stood a sizable pond that shone like a jewel in a crown. I was to learn that it had been customised for her specifically by a highly esteemed designer whom had won multiple awards for his outstanding showmanship in creating and engineering the most awe-inspiring ponds around North America. It was a triumph of note, and it was the epitome of the most enchanting magical pond that I'd ever discerned in all my life. I hasten to add that it far eclipsed mine in terms of its size and splendour. It was a tour de force to be reckoned. I was also bedazzled that something that was not even established at this stage could look this splendiferous, in its beginning stages, of course. I could only imagine what this tranquil oasis would look like in the years to come, once the plants around the pond became firmly established. I'd like to say that I was happy for my neighbour, but I'm sadly not that nice. I was more than a little green at the gills. I was also angry that she'd copied our pond, and I could sense that she was gloating that her pond was bigger and grander than mine. I began to feel like a petulant child, and when I returned home my husband asked me why I had such a long, discomposed face. "Diane's only gone and replicated our pond," I complained, "and hers is bigger and more stunning than ours." I could see she was conceited about it. You could see the smug look all over her face. I promise you she looked obsequious and pompous, just like a stuffed penguin, all puffed up and inflated by her own sense of self-importance. "Darling, there's no need to get so upset. We have a stunning koi pond, and if hers is bigger than ours, does it really matter?" "Yes, it does," I snapped. "It really does. It makes me sick to my stomach, and even the plants she's chosen are identical to ours." "Well, she must have been very impressed with our pond to copy us. They do say that copying someone is the biggest form of flattery." Well, of course she was boasting that she'd hired one of the top men in the business to design her pond, a man who's got so many awards. Can you believe that she had the gall to say, "I won't tell you how much it all cost"? But I discerned by the way that her mouth was twitching upwards that she was bursting to tell me. "What did you say?" asked my husband. I didn't say anything. I knew she wanted me to ask her the price, and so I just told her that her pond was very nice. My husband planted a kiss on my forehead. "You do look so cute when you're jealous," he chuckled. Fast forward a few weeks, and I was spending copious amounts of time relaxing by my pond. I just loved being out there. I loved watching my koi carp, and I loved just listening to the waterfall. But I soon discerned that my koi carp population had diminished and gone down significantly, and I was exceedingly puzzled about this peculiar sequence of events, so I sought some professional advice. I was told that maybe my fish were being attacked by birds of prey, and so I should put some pond netting on the surface, which I did, with what I must say was a great deal of regret, as it does spoil the look of the pond significantly. It was, however, necessary to protect my koi from predators. Yet despite my best efforts, I still began to observe my koi population going down quite dramatically. It was like one fish went missing a day. Once again, I contacted the professional, whom suggested that possibly someone was stealing my fish. "It does happen," he told me. "Koi are in great demand these days, and the big ones don't come cheap." That was a light bulb moment for me, and with horrifying crystal-clear revelation, I knew at once who the mystery culprit was. Was it not enough that she had stolen my thunder by building an even more resplendent pond than my own? But now, to add insult to injury, she was actually stealing some of my koi. I was absolutely appalled and completely disgusted. I mean, how low could she sink? And so it was I surreptitiously paid Diane a casual visit under the guise that I was popping over to say hello. "Oh, this is a lovely surprise," said Diane, opening her door to me. "I was going to come and see you. It's been a long while. I wondered where you've got to these days." "Well, I've been very busy," I snapped. "Would you like a coffee?" she asked. "That would be very nice," I said. "Do you mind if I look at how your pond is coming along?" "Be my guest," she said. I ventured out towards her beautiful glistening pond, and it was filled with copious amounts of bright orange carp. And I knew at once Diane had stolen well over 15 of my koi fish. I was certain of it. I recognised them, and I was as mad as hell. You could say that I was foaming at the mouth like a rabid dog. Not only had she tried to compete with trumping me with a grander, more majestic pond than mine, But now she had the audacity of pilfering some of my koi. I wasn't amused in the least, and I could feel the bile rising up at the back of my throat in total and utter disgust. How dare she, I thought. You have a lot more fish than you used to have, I said, trying to sound as nonchalant as I could. Oh, yes, isn't it wonderful? I was able to purchase them at a good price, she chuckled. I bet, I thought. Liar. Big fat liar, I thought inside my head. When I returned home from Diane, my husband asked me why my face was so long and downcast. You look like a dog that had his eye on the fillet steak and ended up with a dry crust of bread instead, he said. I think this Diane woman rubs you up the wrong way. Every time you visit her, your face transforms itself into a stormy thundercloud. What on earth has she done now? What's wrong? Diane has only been stealing our koi carp, I told him, my face growing crimson with rage. Who does she think she is? She's stolen 15 of our big boys. Are you sure about this? Asked my husband. Of course I'm sure, I told him. I'd recognise my fish anywhere. Well, sweetheart, if that is true, you leave it all well alone. This is a very small town. We don't want to stir up trouble here and create a stink. We have to live next door to these people. The last thing we need is to have squabbles and bad relations with our neighbours. You are just going to have to bite the bullet and pretend it never happened. That's what you do in these situations. But I want my fish back, I protested. Don't do anything stupid, my dear, my husband warned me. Believe me, it's not worth the bother. We can buy more fish, but we're unlikely to get new neighbours, and we don't want to fall out with them, do we? I do remember that night, not having a good night's sleep. I was tossing and turning in my bed, and I was sweating profusely. I knew with certainty that I had to get my fish back. Diane wasn't going to get away with this, I thought to myself angrily. No way. I didn't care what my husband thought, nor did I heed his warnings, because they had fallen on deaf ears. I had other ideas in mind, and a plan was already forming in my head. I lay back in my bed, visualising Diana's gleeful face as she stealthily sneaked into my garden with a very large net in her hand and oversized fish bucket. In my dream, I could clearly see the broad grin on her face getting wider and wider and wider as she began to steal my koi one by one and place them in her pond. Several times during the night, I felt I had to get up. I wanted to be sick and throw up. That was how ill I felt about it all. The following day I had my binoculars pinned on my neighbour's house, and when Diane and her husband left for a shopping trip, I quickly sneaked out of my house with a large net and an oversized bucket in my hand, only to bump into one of my nosy neighbours up the road, walking his 2 French bulldogs up the street. How annoying was that? What are you doing with that big bucket? He said, looking at me with a curious interest. Nothing, I lied. I thought I'd wash down some windows. The gentleman looked at my net and then at my bucket, with a cynical look upon his face, and then, shaking his head, he meandered on his way, glancing back at me a couple of times, but I was not going to allow some pompous upstart to impede my mission in any way. I knew going to my neighbour's pond in the middle of the day was a risky business, but so powerful and overwhelming was this urge to get my fish back that I was totally beyond caring. Before long, I began sneaking into her backyard. I must admit I did feel like a burglar, and I began my mission. Let me assure you that this was not an easy job. It was very difficult to discern which fish were actually mine, so I just settled for any vibrant, attractive, good-looking fish that were similar. The bucket weighed a ton, and the water kept splashing out of my bucket. Before long, I managed to retrieve 10 of my fish, but decided to call it a day as I was utterly exhausted. The very next day, I once again continued with my retrieval project until my fish had all been happily returned to my pond, and the relief I felt was monumental. I have to confess I felt a sense of rising euphoria and triumph that I had finally outsmarted Diane. That would show her up for stealing my fish in the first place, I thought. The following day I received a visit from Diane and invited her in for a cup of coffee. I won't deny that my heart was thumping in my chest a little faster than usual, because I sensed that she was on to me. But then why should I even care? I'd only retrieved what was rightfully mine. Why should I feel remotely guilty? I was just wondering, she asked me, if by any chance you've had any of your koi carp gone missing from your pond over the last couple of days. It would seem that 15 of my fish have just vanished into thin air. I tried to keep my expression very straight and stiff. No, I said. I have all my fish. You know what you should do? You should invest in a pond net. Perhaps you have a bird of prey attacking your fish. I think it might be a very big bird of prey, said Diane sarcastically, giving me a calculated, willful look. One day as I was chopping vegetables in my kitchen, I suddenly saw something standing in my pond. I was stunned, and my first thought was that I was looking at a bear. I reached for my binoculars to have a better look at the critter. I nearly dropped them in astonishment, as I wasn't staring at a bear, but something very hefty that looked rather like a humanoid ape. It was covered in long, flowing, dark brown hair, and it had overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head that flowed into the shoulders in a seamless sweep. I observed the critter had a deep tanned-coloured face with a prominent brow ridge and deep-set dark eyes and a very flat nose, and also a wide but very thin mouth. What was it, I wondered in horror, for never in all my born days had I observed such a strange and curious beast. All of a sudden the critter plunged his big hands into the water and pulled out one of my big koi carp that was wiggling frantically. He thumped the fish hard against the side of my pond and began to eat it like you and I would eat a banana, although he ate the skin as well. I watched in absolute horror as this dreadful scene unfolded before my very eyes, and then once satisfied, the critter leapt out of the pond with the agility of a frog. He glided away into the wooded area that flanked our properties on his powerful long legs in 5-foot strides, with a grace and fluidity that was literally mesmerizing. For a moment I stood still, frozen to the spot, transfixed like a statue. Was it possible I could have imagined that, I thought? No! I knew what I was seeing was dauntingly real. I began to tremble and wobble like a jelly, as the after-effects of my disturbing visual experience unsettled me greatly. For indeed this creature was easily over 7 foot tall and 600 pounds, and was built with power, girth and strength of any imposing predator, much like a rhino or an elephant. I began to make myself a cup of coffee, while I piled copious amounts of sugar in it, without even realizing it, to calm myself down, for my nerves were frazzled. It suddenly occurred to me with horrifying revelation that the perpetrator of my missing koi carp was no other than this hairy humanoid, who had obviously been eating them all. I had been stealing Diane's koi carp in broad daylight, like a blatant in-your-face criminal, and they'd never been mine to take. Diane was innocent, and now I was the thief, and sneakily suspected that she knew that as well. Had she not said to me that the bird of prey must be very big? Was she referring to me? Now I really felt sick to my stomach, and incredibly embarrassed. How could I have got it all so wrong? The next day I decided to take a walk into the sylvan that bordered and fringed the outer perimeters of the properties in our street, from whence the critter had retreated the previous day. I noted a trail of very oversized footprints in the moist ground that I knew belonged to the critter, which I discreetly began to follow, not really even considering that I could potentially be walking into a viper's nest or the devil's lair. For indeed the creature I had observed from my kitchen window was not to be trifled with. Yet I was overcome with a heightened sense of curiosity. The sylvan is almost celestial in its transcendental magnificence, for it is like a world within a world, a sanctuary and oasis of resplendent rich greens. Its dreamy forest canopy embodies a dainty parasol that allows the prettiest shafts of sunlight to flicker through the branches, bathing the floor in dappled prisms of light, creating a sparkling ethereal magic that is indescribable. As I began to walk, the pretty bird song was not lost to my ears, and the brief sightings of songbirds and squirrels brought a smile to my face. Yet my mind was on one mission alone, and it was to uncover the mystery behind the critter that was pilfering my koi. All of a sudden things began to change in the forest, and everything became inauspicious and deathly quiet. So quiet, in fact, that it became menacingly mendacious, disturbingly so. I'd always been informed by my father that when sounds of the forest turn off like a light switch, you can be certain of one thing: and that is that a predator is in your midst. I stood very still for a moment, hardly daring to draw breath, as I discerned that the critter I had observed could indeed be close by. This was almost certainly confirmed by the cocktail of pungent odours that perforated my nostrils with a stench that is unlike anything I have ever smelt in my life. It rather reminded me of a skunk. That was when I heard a man's yelling voice. I crept cautiously ever closer and hid behind a large spruce tree. I was not prepared for what I was about to see. I recognised the man, for he was the homeless vagrant that I sometimes saw begging in the town outside the local bakery. He wore layers of dishevelled clothes that hung off his body in limp rags. I could tell the intoxicated man was pixelated as his tipsy body swayed precariously like a tree being blown in a heavy wind, and in one wobbly hand he held a bottle of vodka, most of which was drained. The last remnants which he kept pouring down his gullet in large, frantic swigs. Why had he screamed, I wondered? Was it because he was off his head in a drunken stupor, or had something frightened him? The sloshed vagrant cried out again, and I realised it was because he was staring at a huge, hairy humanoid, much like the one I had seen languishing in my pond the day prior. Yet this critter was different. He was infinitely more foreboding and menacing, and was unlike anything that I've ever beheld in my entire life. He looked like the devil himself. I began to tremble and shake as my body lost its ability to control its impulses. I also wanted to scream out in terror, but my vocal cords seemed to be locked. I could taste the bitter nausea rising up in the back of my throat. I longed to turn around and just run away, but I was incapacitated by the sheer horror of what I was witnessing. It was as if my life flashed before me in a series of photographs as I watched this hideous, duplicitous scene unfold before my very eyes. It seemed like a lifetime, but in reality it was possibly only a few seconds or minutes at the very most. Yet in the fabric of our time, it seemed to last forever. This hostile, capricious critter, whatever in God's name it was, had an evil, demonical, portentous glint in his dark, malevolent eyes that twinkled with a hideously reddish hue. He stood yards away from the man, leering at him savagely, and his mouth curled back to reveal a large set of oversized human-like teeth. He began to growl, easily eclipsing the roar of a lion, for the ground reverberated under the sound. The inebriated, bladdered vagrant stared at the critter with glazed eyes, and seemed transfixed. I think he may have believed the alcohol he'd been drinking was having hallucinatory effects on him, for he looked stunned, almost as if he was certain he must be dreaming. I couldn't blame him for that, for the critter seemed so surreal, almost as if he had walked out of the pages of your darkest, most terrifying nightmares into our reality. Yet I knew without a doubt that this critter was as real as you and I are. "Go away! Go away!" slurred the drunken man, waving his arms around as if he was wishing away his illusory nightmare. "Go away!" I watched him staggering around and slurring on his inaudible words. "Now, you go away," he said, waving his bottle precariously. "You go away. Now you go away. Go away. Go away." Once again the critter growled, and then he lunged forward and seized the vagrant into his oversized hands like a rag doll, and whirled the man in the air, tossing him up and down like a pancake. The man was still screaming, "Go away! Go away!" The critter seemed to enjoy the sport of scaring his victim half to death, and then finally he threw the man on the ground with an almighty thump, and the man let out the most painful grunts, for he was still alive and slurring. "Oh! Oh! Ooh!" This monstrous beast grabbed his neck and twisted it to the other side of his head, and I could hear that final click, and I knew it was all over, for the vagrant at least. I stood behind the spruce tree, hardly daring to draw breath, for indeed I was afraid that the very sound of my breathing, or even the drumming of my heart, would alert the critter to my presence. But I'm pleased to say he was oblivious to me. I knew that I needed to stay as still as I possibly could, because running off was not an option for me. Even my legs felt as heavy as bricks of cement, and my heart was in my mouth. I also knew if the critter saw me or heard me, I was dead. The critter was breathing heavily and sounded like a horse. He began to kick the dead body like a football, as if even in death the man offended and appalled and repulsed him. He had no respect for the human form, for in some way it offended him greatly. I watched in horror as he ripped off one of the man's arms like you and I would tear a chicken drumstick off a cooked chicken. He then glided over to the tree trunk and sat upright with his torso propped up against the tree, and his powerful legs spread out in front of him. He began to eat the arm, and he gobbled it up until all the bones were stripped clean. He then went over to the corpse and gouged out the eyeballs from the sockets as if they were delectable cocktail olives, and popped them into his mouth and ate them with great gusto. He did the same for the tongue. Finally, the critter threw the body over a tree trunk, much like a sack of potatoes, where it dangled precariously from the branches, like a white mannequin with open sockets. He then left it there and glided into the forest and was gone from my sight, permeating the air with a hideous stench. It took me a long while to compose myself after the critter finally left, and trembling I went over to a bush and vomited violently. How I managed to manoeuvre my body after that through the Sylvan back home, I don't even know, but I managed to get there. My husband describes me as being in a very strange, catatonic, contrived state when I returned home. He said that I was so dazed that I was spaced out and didn't say a thing for many hours. He sensed that I was clearly shocked by something and waited patiently for me to come out of my abstract delirium. Eventually my husband gave me a couple of shots of brandy, which I downed very gratefully. I then informed him what I'd witnessed in the Sylvan, and he listened intently, but I knew he didn't believe that I'd seen an ape-like humanoid. He kept telling me that I must have been mistaken, and it must have been a bear, which was exceedingly frustrating, for I knew what I saw. It was no bear, I insisted. It was a giant humanoid ape that was 9 foot tall and 900 pounds, with evil eyes and long shaggy hair. My words fell on deaf ears as my husband informed the sheriff that I had seen the local homeless vagrant killed by a bear in the Sylvan. When the police searched the area, there was no sign of the vagrant, whom had seemingly vanished into thin air, but they did find blood on the tree that I'd pointed out. Rumours abounded and circulated around our town that the local vagrant had been mauled and killed by a bear, but his body was never found nor recovered. It was only many years later that I was to discover that the creatures that I had witnessed were Bigfoots. It was very strange that the smaller Bigfoot that had been pilfering koi from my pond never returned. He didn't strike me as evil like the critter that I observed killing the vagrant. If that was the case, I would never have followed those footsteps into the Sylvan. I have a gnawing feeling in my gut that he also was brutally murdered by that ghastly Bigfoot. I was informed by a friend of mine in the town that Diane had a trail camera installed near her pond, and she actually had footage of me creeping to her pond and hauling out her koi carp and pinching them. She said she'd seen the footage of me furtively looking around like a real criminal. My friend told me that Diane thought that I was so jealous of her pond that I wanted to steal her koi carp. I hasten to say that I just could not confess to Diane what I had done or why I had done it, because I was so embarrassed and humiliated. Indeed, so much so that I never even told my husband what I did. I couldn't bear the humiliation of him saying, "I told you so. I told you not to interfere." So even these days, wherever I see Diane, I tend to give her a wide berth, and she always looks at me with a look of, "I know what you did." So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what a fabulous story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.